This bonus scene fits inside Chapter 4 of Defying Zeus. Solace Station is scrambling to find a cure for the deadly toxin Baylor has released. Meggie has collapsed and is in the infirmary. Sara has stormed off to her room, but not before urging Elizabeth to take advantage of their last days and go for a walk in the gardens together with Tarn, the guardian warrior who loves her. They share one stolen moment before he has to leave her forever. One stolen kiss to last a lifetime. The gardens were lovely, but Elizabeth hardly saw them. After all, they'd just been told they were going to die. The toxin that Baylor had planted in the ship's air ducts was going to kill them all if they couldn't open Megara's message and find her. Meggie had already fainted. Elizabeth shivered. "Are you cold?" Tarn asked. "Here, have my jacket." He shouldered out of the structured black uniform coat and draped it over Elizabeth's shoulders. It hung on her frame, despite her generous figure, and fell halfway to her knees. Tarn's eyes flared in satisfaction for a moment, and Elizabeth felt herself respond. She wasn't cold, but she liked wearing his jacket, liked being covered by him, being cared for by him. He offered her his arm. She had to push the heavy sleeve back so her hand could curve inside his elbow. The gardens on board Solace Station were larger than she'd expected. They stretched out as far as the eye could see, rolling hills and small forests stretching to the artificial horizon. Above them, the ceiling wasn't visible. Instead, it just looked like a blue sky dotted with scudding, heavy gray clouds. There was even an artificial sun shining down on them, glittering on the surface of a small lake. Despite their terrible situation, Elizabeth found herself relaxing. It might be artificial, but it felt real, the sun warming her chilled face. They walked past a greenhouse, full of thick-leaved, vividly colored tropical plants. There was a rotunda further away and benches and tables scattered around. "This is a space station," Elizabeth mused. "Why would you give so much space to nature in a space station?" "Nature is important," Tarn explained. "We're still human. We need to see and interact with the natural world. It's a part of our physical and mental health. Many guardians come here to exercise, to socialize, to relax." Looking up at him, Elizabeth realized that being in the gardens had relaxed his tense shoulders a little, too. "The gardens are intentionally close to the infirmary. We have mental health needs, too. Having access to an open space, to gardens, the sun, and the sweet air is well known to increase health and well-being in those who are physically or mentally unwell." "Where is everyone else, then?" "They forecast rain for the afternoon." "Rain?" She laughed disbelievingly. "Rain?" He just nodded. "The weather in the gardens is programmed to match the weather back on Valor. It changes every day and changes with the seasons. Being out in space can be quite disorienting, so it helps us to align ourselves with the seasons and cycles of nature." They walked down towards the lake and stood by its shore. "I remember Auntie Meg kissing my boo-boos better when I was a little girl," Elizabeth told him, looking out at the glittering water of the lake that rippled with the faint breeze that pushed the clouds across the artificial sky. "I was very small when she died. Disappeared, I mean, but I remember she could make me feel better than anyone else but Mom." Tarn nodded. "Megara was fabled to have extraordinary healing powers, but mothers have healing powers too, like mates. Are you warmer?" He put his arm around her shoulders and drew her close to his body. "I feel warm now," she told him. "Tell the truth and shame the devil, Bess. What you're feeling right now is hot, and it's nothing to do with temperature." She looked up at him, and there was more than a matching warmth in his eyes, too. "That was how I met you, Tarn. You were healing me." Tarn's face twisted. "I'll never forgive myself for not being able to get you away from him in time. You weren't even there when he shot me." "I should have been there." His gray eyes were very intense. "I should have always been there, Bess. I should have set out for Earth the day I first saw you in the mirror, and damn the penalty of the fates." "The penalty of the fates?" she asked. Tarn nodded. When a warrior reaches his graduation, he is shown the face of his mate in the mirror of the fates, as she will appear when they first meet. Since men take longer to mature, we're often older than our mates, and a man doesn't want to see a picture of a child. He wants to see the woman she will become. If a guardian approaches his mate before the time the fates have allotted for him, there are severe penalties. If he approaches her when she is too young, he forfeits all the joy she could bring to his life, and their bond is severed. Elizabeth raised her hand to cover his where it curved around her shoulder. I'm glad you didn't then. I wouldn't give this up, Tarn. I would have, he gritted. Surprised, she looked up at him and found him staring across the lake. I would have given up every joy I will ever know if I could have kept you from all you've suffered. Being shot, the slavers being taken again today, and now exposing you to a deadly poison. His jaw flexed. I would give my life to have spared you from all this, Bess. His voice roughened. By the gods, sweetheart, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Elizabeth hadn't expected the sudden rough movement as he gathered her into his arms, but she was ready for it. She'd been ready for this since the moment she'd opened her eyes and seen him bent over her, healing her. She'd half raised her arms, but he was too quick for her, and she ended up with her arms sandwiched between them. With a sigh, she slid them around his waist and let her body press into his for the first time. He groaned, deep and low in the back of his throat, and whispered her name and a prayer. Bess. Gods, Bess, I love you. She rubbed her hands up and down the powerful muscles that bracketed his spine, loving the feel of him under her hands, loving the feel of his broad chest crushing against her, his arms like warm steel around her. Tarn pulled away a little, just enough so he could look into her eyes. I love you, Bess, he told her solemnly. If I live 300 years, I will never love anyone but you. Her heart was too full to speak. She opened her mouth to whisper his name, and no sound came out but a sigh. He was the most handsome man she'd ever seen, his eyes a striking silver, his jaw so straight it might have been carved in granite, and he was looking at her like she was the most beautiful, most desirable woman he'd ever seen. Her ex-husband had never looked at her like that, not even in the early days. I need you, Bess, Tarn whispered, splaying his hands over her back and waist. I need you in my life. I need you close to me. I'll always need you. Only you. He bent his head as he spoke, so the last words feathered over her parted lips, so close that she could feel the warmth of his mouth. He shivered in her arms, and at the very last moment, turned his head to bury his face in her shoulder. Elizabeth couldn't hold back the small sound of disappointment she made. I'm so sorry, Bess, he groaned, his usually cultured voice rough and deep. His arms tightened around her. I have no right to hold you like this. I'm the worst kind of man for stealing an embrace, but at least my conscience is still alive enough to keep me from stealing a kiss I have no right to take. Oh, Tarn. Elizabeth reached up to touch his face. It felt like a miracle to be able to touch him like this, to feel the faint roughness of his stubbled cheek under her soft, seeking fingers. You're not stealing anything, baby. I'm giving it to you. Her fingers slipped over his lips, tracing their outline. Kiss me, Tarn. I want you to kiss me. For one moment, his hands tightened on her to just this side of pain. Then he was letting her go. I can't, Bess. He ran his hands through his hair like he needed something to hold on to. I can't. There are things you don't know. This mission, to retrieve Artemis, it was going to be my last mission. Elizabeth felt her knees go weak, and she reached out to him, not just for reassurance, but to keep her balance. God, Tarn, she breathed. Are you saying Are you sick? Are you dying? He caught the seeking hand she reached out to him, and even that small touch made her feel like the ground was steady under her feet again. No, Bess, I'm not sick. He checked himself and looked around. He couldn't see the air vents in the artificial sky above them, but from the bitterness on his face, Elizabeth already knew what he was thinking. Not yet anyway, but Bess... He came closer, not letting go of her hand. No matter how I feel about you, we can't ever be together. It isn't fair to steal a kiss when you can never be mine. Why not? Elizabeth protested, moving a little closer. If you're worried about my ex-husband, don't be. He's very much in the past. I was so young when I married him. Young and stupid. Our marriage was a painful mistake. A fierce light came into Tarn's eyes. Did he hurt you, Bess? A dark part of Elizabeth was tempted to say, yes, but while Kevin deserved every bit of unhappiness he'd brought on himself, he didn't deserve the bloody vengeance she could see building in Tarn's eyes. No, she lied. But he's in my past. He isn't going to ruin the rest of my life, too. He isn't going to keep us apart. She saw Tarn blink and swallow hard. He'd been completely distracted from the way he'd been telling her they could never be together. Elizabeth wondered if maybe she could distract him some more. She took another tiny step closer and laid her hand on his chest. His free hand came up immediately to hold her hand against his heart, even as he kept his other hand warm and firm around hers at their side. "Don't you want me, Tarn?" she asked softly. She felt the tremor that ran through his whole body. "I want you enough to betray everything I believe in," he gritted. "I would give my life just to see you smile, but I can't marry you, Bess. My grandfather is dying and I must return home to take his place. If I don't return, thousands of people will die. Perhaps millions." Elizabeth's mouth fell open. She closed it carefully. "I think you'd better explain, Tarn." He nodded. "Come," he said, guiding her to a nearby bench, half secluded by bushes that enclosed it on 3 sides, leaving the view clear to look over the lake. "Sit here with me while I explain, Bess." She sat, but he didn't sit with her. He paced, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. "My grandfather was a poor leader. He instituted a series of policies that suppressed our ancient enemies, a people known as the Olana. They were forced from their homes, into the forests, their population decimated. When I take my grandfather's place on the throne, I have a chance to end the bloodshed. I can mark a new point in our history when all nations on Garia can live in peace. I've known all my life that this will be my fate, and I know that the quickest way to end the war will be to take a bride from among the Olana. Our peoples have been at war for too long for anything less to bring peace. They need to see that I am committed to the unity of our planet, both in my public and private life." He was pacing back and forth in front of her the whole time. He stopped suddenly and turned to her. "I have no choice, Bess. My life is not my own. It never has been. It never will be." Feeling terribly proud of her self-control, Elizabeth said, "I see," very carefully. "Tarn, what position does your grandfather hold?" "He is king of Garia," Tarn answered. "I see," she said again, and folded her hands in her lap. "Forgive my ignorance, but is Garia a country on your planet?" "No, Bess. Garia is the name of the planet. My grandfather is the hereditary ruler of the planet." She was glad she was sitting down. "I understand," she said primly. "Thank you for explaining this to me, Tarn. I appreciate it." She felt like she was back at work, being professional while some parliamentary representative was behaving like a child. She hated feeling that way with him. Tarn knelt at her feet. "It isn't my choice, Bess, I swear to you," he assured her. "If I had any choice at all in this matter, you know I would choose you. You know that, don't you?" He reached for her hands, but she pulled them away. "No, Tarn," she said stiffly. "You were right. You had no right to kiss me. My work in foreign affairs might not often see me being propositioned by a king, but I'm not fool enough to want the life of a royal mistress. My ex-husband cheated on me, and of all the things he did, that hurt the most. I wouldn't do that to anyone. Tarn went so still she was afraid she'd wounded him. She'd had to be blunt. He'd been right. They had no right to pursue this, and it would be best for everyone if they put a stop to it now. He was silent for a dozen heartbeats. "Say you'll forgive me, Bess." "There's nothing to forgive," she said smartly, and stood up, brushing down her skirt. She looked up again as it suddenly went dark. Above her, it looked like a heavy cloud had occluded the artificial sun. "Why would someone simulate clouds?" she asked peevishly. "They did forecast rain for today." Tarn frowned as he looked up at the artificial sky and the swiftly gathering clouds. "We'd better go in quickly. The weather can change very quickly this time of year. We don't want to get caught in the rain." As soon as he spoke the last word, the first fat drops fell from the sky. Tarn grabbed Elizabeth's hand and ran with her to the greenhouse. They slipped inside the door a moment before the rain came down like a waterfall. They were both breathless from their sprint to the greenhouse and laughing awkwardly as they sluiced water from their clothes and hair. "Oh no," Elizabeth cried, looking around. "Tarn, your jacket. I must have left it back at the bench. I'm so sorry." She brushed out the droplets that marked his shirt, turning it translucent and clinging to his skin. She could see the faint shadow of his chest hair through the fine white silk of his shirt. It was only when she felt his hands close on her shoulders that she looked up at his face and saw the raw desire there. The rain had also turned her shirt transparent, and it clung to her skin. The greenhouse was deserted, and the large-leafed tropical plants clustered thickly around them. They were completely alone. Alone. For what might be the last time, Elizabeth realized. Recklessly, she stroked her hands over the wet silk that covered his broad shoulders, letting him feel that it could be nothing but a caress this time. She let her hands curve around his neck, reaching one hand up to cup his cheek as she raised herself on tiptoe and kissed him. His skin was slightly chilled from the rain, but his lips were warm as she covered them with her own. His hands, still curved around her shoulders, brought her even closer to him until she was crushed against him. Elizabeth's knees went weak, but it didn't matter because he was holding her so tightly. The hand she'd curled around his neck clutched tightly, and she was pretty sure that her other hand was pulling his hair, but he didn't seem to care. He just bent over her and deepened the kiss. Her heartbeat was thundering in her ears, so loud that she was dizzy. She let herself melt in his arms, surrendering to him. His lips broke from hers on a shuddering sigh, and he buried his face in her shoulder. "Bess, we shouldn't," he groaned. "I won't tell if you won't." It was meant to come out as a teasing sally, but his lips had found her earlobe, and it came out as a sigh. Despite his protests, he was still holding her tight against him. She was completely lost in his kisses, completely lost in him, and there was nothing to stand in their way. Except Teresa's thin, terrified voice that shredded through her mind. "Bess! Tarn! Quick! Come to the infirmary! Sara's hurt!" Then Tarn was lifting her down from the bench, helping her lower her skirt and find the sensible black pump that had fallen off her foot while they were kissing. "Bess," he began. "I know it can't happen again," Elizabeth interrupted recklessly, her breathing still uneven. "But I'd be lying if I told you I regretted a single moment." "I will never forget it as long as I live," he confessed roughly. It was still raining, but just a light fall now, no longer the torrential downpour that had led them to seek shelter in the greenhouse. "Ready?" Tarn asked, taking her hand in his. Elizabeth nodded. "Ready." Then Tarn opened the door and they ran out into the rain. The story continues in Deceiving Apollo, the alien king's fake bride. Sparks fly when this alien king needs a fake bride, but can they ever really be together when he's promised to marry someone else? They have shared one stolen, passionate kiss when Elizabeth agrees to become Earth's ambassador to Tarn's planet of Garia. Newly ascended to the throne, Tarn is determined to right the wrongs of his grandfather's reign and bring peace to his planet. He will do anything to stop the war, even if it means making a political marriage with Samara, the daughter of his enemy. In order to ratify the marriage, Tarn must take his new bride to the House of Apollo. But Samara refuses to go. In desperation, he asks Elizabeth to accompany him and pretend to be his bride. It isn't hard, pretending to be in love with the man who has already captured her heart. Torn between duty and desire, they embrace the deception as the only time they can ever be together. But can they escape execution when Samara's father arrives at the House of Apollo and threatens to expose them? And after everything they have shared at the House of Apollo, what will they do when they return to Garia and Tarn has to marry someone else? Prepare to be captivated and thrilled by this steamy science fiction romance series where powerful women and their fated mates traverse a dark and dangerous galaxy together.